There we go. Okay, go right
Okay,
ahead.
seems to be working. All right, so tonight's session, think like a UX writer. Originally had a different name. You probably joined thinking, I thought we were going to talk, I don't know, what was it originally? Designing interface copy, which honestly is not great, like especially if I'm talking about really good plain language, which I will be. So I iterated on the title after throwing out a crummy first draft. So now we're thinking like a UX writer, which is a lot clearer, I hope. And it will speak to the subject that we're going to be talking about tonight. So just briefly, just want to talk a little bit about me, but not too much about me, just so you understand why I'm qualified to be talking to you here tonight. For the last like 3 years or so, I've worked as a UX writer, most recently in fintech for a startup, and before that in education. Going back, I don't know, I probably have about 15 years of editorial experience at this point, having been a copy editor as well, a reporter, worked in learning experience design. So really just a lot of different roles that have focused on writing and editing, which have sort of come together in a good way because UX writing takes really a lot of those pieces into account. I am also, as it says here, a wannabe Great British Baking Show contestant. Unfortunately, I'm not British, so I will actually never be on that show. I might be on like the bad American knockoff of it someday, but I can dream. So in this session, these are the things we're going to talk about. So first of all, just what is UX writing? Just going to give a brief overview. And then we'll move on to voice versus tone, because that's a really important part of understanding UX writing landscape, knowing the difference between those two things and what stays constant and what can change. Then we'll go into probably what you're here for if you're a designer, kind of writing tips for non-UX writers. I almost put writing tips for non-writers, but really everybody's a writer in some way. So I wanted to specify it's for non-UX writers, right? So people who aren't engaged in this as a full-time job, but there's a lot of things that we do that are pretty easily applicable to other people who do any kind of writing, which is just about everybody. So I'll talk about some tips for writing interface content that works. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about some tools of the trade, some things I use to make my job a little bit easier. And I will say, I unfortunately didn't make this as interactive as I like to generally do when I'm doing a presentation. Like I usually try to embed poll everywhere, things like that get the audience involved a little bit. So I no longer have institutional access to those things, so I wasn't able to embed them in this presentation. So that's why they're not here. But all that to say that if you have questions or want to jump in and ask a question, or like just like Steve said, throw it in the chat or even just unmute and stop me. That's totally fine. I am good to have this be kind of a participatory presentation. Okay, so that's the background. I am going to get us started. So first off, what is UX writing? A brief overview. So UX content, this is a definition that I kind of came up with, took it from a few different sources. But really what it boils down to is it's content that informs users and guides them to their goals. And you will notice that I kind of called out the word content here because it's not always just words, right? So the title is UX writer for a lot of people, but it's not always just writing. It often is a lot more than that. Really, a UX writer's goal is to think about the best ways to convey information at any point along the user journey. A lot of times that does take the form of text or language, but honestly, like just as often, it's getting rid of text, right? So I think we've all been in the case where you're looking at a giant web page that has way too much going on. And sometimes it's all about getting into that and boiling down what's the most important piece and getting rid of all of the stuff that you don't need, separating the wheat from the chaff. Is that the word? So yeah, and on top of that, it's not just editing content down, it might also be adding an image or embedding a video or some sort of interactive graphic instead of just more and more walls of text. So really it's just thinking about that information that a user needs at any given point in time, and then thinking about the best delivery method for that. So I want to talk a little bit about titles because they are confusing, and there's often a lot of different ones being thrown out there. So you'll hear content designers, UX writers, UX copywriters, UX product writer, tech writer, and then you have UX content strategists, which is confusing because there's also like marketing content strategists. So I'm just going to, there's honestly a lot of overlap and even some debate about like what title is what, but I'll just talk about the big three. So really, like UX content strategist, that's somebody who's thinking about kind of a bigger picture, often more tactical. They are the person who often will kind of own like the company style guide and dictate the product voice. And they're also thinking and making sure that that product voice aligns to the brand voice. And they're also thinking about bigger picture, almost like logistical stuff, like how content is managed and how it's maintained. And then you have a UX writer, which is a position I've been in before. They're the person who's writing that in product copy, micro copy. They're the one making sure that it flows in a logical way. They're working really closely with product designers and product managers to make sure that they understand product requirements and making sure that the flows that they're working on meet those requirements. And then you have content designer. That's another one that is used pretty interchangeably with UX writer. It's considered, I think like on paper, it's considered to be a bit more broad than UX writer, that they think about the product maybe in a bit of a bigger picture way than just a UX writer would. They're also probably thinking about nomenclature and taxonomies and product names. But to be honest, in practice, these are used pretty interchangeably. Some companies just prefer UX writer, some prefer content designer. I think in general, there's a bit of a preference in the industry for content designer because it speaks more to the design aspects of this role. People don't want to be shoehorned as just writers because, like I said, often you're not only writing, you're doing really content design. So I'm going to keep saying UX writers, so I'm going to contradict what I just said, but just so you know what I'm kind of talking about, the field in general. But UX writers, what do they write? So of course, it's a lot of microcopy. These are the small bits of copy in the user interface that help users figure out how to do things, like tooltips, buttons, error messages, lots and lots of error messages. And sometimes they'll also write longer form copy. So like FAQs or in-product emails, help content, video scripts, that kind of thing. Honestly, good UX content is mostly and largely invisible. The point of it is to get users where they need to go without distracting them. It is not flashy at all. It is honestly like the least sexy form of writing that exists, which is funny because you see people in UX writing and content design forums sometimes saying like, I really want to get into UX writing. I have a background in creative writing. This would be cool to do as a job. And like, there's always someone there to kind of burst their bubble and be like, I'm sorry, but this, like, you might enjoy this work, but it's not going to be like anything like the creative writing you've done in the past. And that's not to say that you'd never have fun with it. There are opportunities to kind of be clever, but for the most part, you're trying not to really be clever or cutesy. You don't really want the language to stand out. You want it to just be so intuitive that it just guides users where they're trying to go without getting in their way. So this is probably pretty obvious from what I just said, but UX copywriting is not the same as, UX writing is not the same as copywriting. A maxim that I've heard that I think really explains it well is that we tell, we don't sell. We leave the selling part to the copywriters. They're the ones who are trying to influence an action. We're just trying to guide that action. I really liked this tweet, or I don't know, do we call it an X now? But here's what our product can do, and here's what you can do with our product. Sounds similar, but they're completely different approaches. And I think this is a really very succinct and good way of explaining the difference between UX writing and copywriting. UX writing is all about explaining the benefit to the user. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. So we've now arrived at part 2, which is voice versus tone and what's the difference here. I'll take a quick pause in case anyone has a question. Okay, I will continue. All right, so voice versus tone. So your voice, that should really be the same everywhere across your product and should be consistent absolutely everywhere you talk to users. So on your website, if you have an app, on social media and emails, your voice is always your voice. You shouldn't have one voice on your website, another in the app. That's just going to lead to confusion from your users about what your brand represents. And I think an interesting thing here is that even if you haven't defined what your product's voice is, it does have a voice, right? Like people have a perception of what it is. Even if you haven't had that intentionality in determining your product voice, it has one. So it's good and important to be intentional about determining what that voice should be. And there's ways to do that if you work in an org. A lot of places probably already have this. It comes from marketing a lot of times, like the brand attributes and values, but maybe a smaller place or a startup doesn't necessarily have those things. But if you think of your brand values, you can map like what voice attributes would support that to support what your brand should be. And once you have all of that outlined, you can use that as a rubric for future content. So any bit of string you write in the future, you can compare it against what your brand voice should be and determine, does that actually meet the brand values that we've outlined? So your voice is, along with your visual identity and the interaction design of your brand, it makes up the personality of the brand. It's a big part of the personality, and it's how your users perceive you. Here is an example of a brand voice I put together for the startup where I was working most recently. When I started, we didn't really have these outlined, or there were some voice attributes, but they were really old and we were going through a rebrand and we needed to outline new ones that reflected what we were trying to move toward in the rebrand. So I worked with our marketing team and we did some research on what users found valuable and what they were looking for in a financial institution, because it was a neobank. And so really first and foremost, the most important thing we realized is trustworthiness, right? Like if you're going to put your money into our bank, we want you to feel safe in trusting your money to us. And that was something that we hadn't really, like when we looked back at a lot of the legacy content, we realized we hadn't necessarily been putting a lot of stock into. You have to assure people that the money that they're putting in with you and the personal information is safe, and kind of back that up really about anywhere you're asking for that. So that was really important and that floated right to the top of things that we wanted to make sure was included in that brand voice. And in doing this too, I also had sent out a survey to the staff of the whole organization to get their feedback about what they felt our brand values should be. And that served two purposes. One, it was to get that information. It was really helpful to understand what people working there felt, but it also had a lot of staff buy-in, right? Like people felt engaged in the process of defining our brand voice and helps them to feel engaged in that process. And actually through that surveying, we found that there was a lot of consensus about what we wanted our voice to be. So it was a really helpful process. So like I said, our voice is consistent, but tone is going to change, and it will change based on what we're talking about, who we're talking to, and how that person might be feeling in the moment we're talking to them. So there's a good example here. So I think back to like being a kid and hearing one of my parents on the phone. And no matter who they were talking to, they always, it always sounded like my mom. Like I recognize her voice anywhere. She has a certain way of speaking, intonations. She uses certain words. So like, no matter who she's talking to, I know like that's my mom. But I could always tell generally who she's talking to based on the tone that she's using, right? So if she's sort of casual, chatty, and maybe laughing a bit, she's probably talking to her friend or her sister Julie. But if she's like a little short with the person on the phone or sounds a bit annoyed because they're calling during dinner, it's probably someone like a telemarketer. So, I think that's a good example. So like the voice is the voice. My mother has a certain voice, but her tone is going to change depending on who she's talking to and how she feels in that moment. So as a UX writer, it's really important to be attuned to your user's tone, because it's very, it's just like UX design. You have to have a lot of empathy for your users. Like in real life, if somebody's like weeping to you, you're probably not responding to them with jokes. Or if they tell you good news, you're probably not staring at them with just a blank, straight face. You're going to respond to their emotions and respond in kind. And our content needs to do the same. So this is a tone chart that I had put together at the last place I worked to sort of show like where the tone can change based on the different piece of content that you might be working on. So, there's the serious to fun and concise to detailed. So something, if it's a legal disclosure, that's going to err on the side of more serious for obvious reasons, right? And help articles. Somebody who's seeking out a help article is looking to solve a problem. They probably don't want to be distracted with like cutesy content at that moment. So we're going to keep that piece of content pretty serious. But then again, when we have someone onboarding to our app and maybe we're working on a mobile game, we want to make that process pretty fun and we want to encourage them to return. So we're going to make that fun in the process. So having this kind of mapping can be pretty helpful to understand, especially when you have a team of UX writers and you want to make sure that people are synced and sort of writing in that same voice and using similar tones throughout the product. So this voice chart, this is from Nielsen Norman Group. They did all their research and they figured out basically there are 4 tonal dimensions of voice, ranging from formal to casual, serious to funny, respectful to irreverent, and matter-of-fact to enthusiastic. So the idea is that basically all voices can be boiled down to these dimensions. So I think it can be an interesting exercise in your organization to determine, have you outlined your voice and where do you fall on this? And then potentially to survey your users and see if they sort of agree with where you think your voice is and with how your users perceive your voice. I'm going to show, so I think it's pretty well known that I think Slack has pretty good micro copy. So I've included a few examples here of sort of the fun micro copy that you see within Slack. This is like when you DM yourself. You can talk to yourself here, but please bear in mind you'll have to supply both sides of the conversation. So it's a bit irreverent, it's cute. And if I were to map that on the tone of voice, this is just me taking a stab at it. They might map it a little differently, but this is me as a user, how I perceive that to be. It's erring a lot more close to casual than formal, closer to funny than serious, pretty irreverent, and somewhere kind of between matter-of-fact and enthusiastic. So I think this is a helpful exercise, and these tools are all out there. But even if your org might already have these things defined, but it can be helpful for anybody who's writing that interface content to have this mapping, like as a reference so that they can use that. They can write a piece of microcopy and say, like, are we hitting on the tone of voice dimensions that we're trying to hear? Okay, so now I'm going to get into the actual writing tips for non-UX writers. These are the more practical applications of the things. And I think I have about 12 of them. I had 13 and then decided one was getting cut. And I just wanted to say that this is like a 45-minute conversation. There's a lot of things here I couldn't include. So this is kind of high level. It's just general tips that I think are pretty easy to take away. But there's of course a lot more. And if anybody wants to get into it, I can suggest many resources to do that. But first of all, okay, so tip 1 is to lead with the benefit to the user. So do you remember the tweet about don't think about like, here's what our product can do. You want to think about, here's what you can do with our product. So generally that means like leading with the verb, the benefit to the user. And this is really similar to in journalism, what they call the inverted pyramid. I went to journalism school and I remember learning about this. You want to front load the most important information when you write. So it ends up being like this inverted pyramid. So if the reader only reads the first few paragraphs, they've gotten the meat of the story. And it goes back to these like old newspaper days when you had a certain number of inches per story and they could just hack off the last few paragraphs as they needed to make it fit in the newspaper. But it's the same idea here, is put the most important stuff, front load it at the beginning, and then just get rid of everything that you don't need. And I just have one quick example here. This is, I think, from GitHub, just to show that that's exactly what they've done here, right? They front loaded the benefit to the user. With our tool, you can write better code, manage your chaos, and find the right tools. It's not selling it. So, all right, in a CTA, so call to action, you want to tell users exactly what happens next. So these can be a little tricky to write. They should always reflect exactly what's going to happen when the user selects them. Ideally, you're going to try for not more than 3 words. I've seen some that are 4 that tend to work, but like I would not go more than 4 words with a CTA. You want to keep them as brief as possible. Often they will have a verb. Most of the time they will, but sometimes they might just be like, okay, which can work depending on the context. On the left here, this is a pretty famous example from Google. This was the hotel search on Google. Originally, they had it as book a room. So like you'd search for a date and then you check out and click book a room. But really at that point, you weren't booking a room. They changed it to check availability because that's actually what you were doing at that point. You were checking to see if that hotel had availability on the date that you wanted. And they found this great boost in engagement, not just because the CTA actually reflected better what the action the user was taking, but because it also shows that there's lower commitment, right? Like book a room feels a little stressful because you might think that you're somehow being locked in with your credit card or whatnot. So checking availability is a much lower stake CTA. And then I also just included this this picture I took of Netflix, very high resolution picture of just change profile picture. I just thought this was great because it's super, they've boiled it down, right? So there's not very many words on this screen at all. Change profile icon, let's do it, or not yet. And I love that they showed the before and after. So you can see that I had the cheetah and I'm changing it to the, is that an aardvark? Some, you know, a tapir maybe. But I love that you get to preview that before you've committed to doing it. And that's why I want, like, let's do it as a good CTA there because I know exactly what happens if I change that. Yes, just on the topic of CTAs, you want to avoid these general buttons. I just put this in here as an example of what not to do. Sorry to whatever website I got this from. You don't want to use learn more or read more, and especially not use multiple ones of these. You don't want to use these because they're really not very informative. They're not really telling your user what's going to happen if they click on those. I don't know exactly what I'm going to be learning about. And they're not great for screen readers, particularly when you have multiple of these, because if a user's navigating with a screen reader from one button to the next, they're just going to hear learn more, learn more, learn more. They're not going to know that this learn more goes with web fonts and this one goes with Bootstrap 3. So avoid these generic CTAs as much as possible. Tip 3, this is probably an obvious one, but avoid jargon. I mean, like just reading that gives me a headache. I don't know what that says. I don't know what that means. There are times, of course, depending on what industry you work in, where you may need to use industry-specific terms. But in general, you can often avoid these things. Like when I was most recently working for the neobank, you know, I'd see a lot of times people saying funds, which that's not like the most jargony of phrases, but money is a lot more understandable. So I remember changing at one point deposit funds to add money. That's basically the same thing, but add money is just so much more colloquial and easy to understand, especially just right away as soon as you hear it. So as much as possible, just use simple, familiar terms that your users also use. And I found this decision tree pretty helpful. I mean, it's kind of obvious in some ways, but if it's just thinking like a little gut check, basically, if I'm going to use this term, do my readers actually know what it is? And if you have a niche audience, then yeah, maybe they do. And it may be weird if you didn't use that jargon for them. But in most cases, especially if you have sort of a general audience, you want to think about it and determine whether that's actually worth doing. And I just threw an example here from that I wrote at one point because we needed to explain what a cohort was. We determined like we shouldn't not use this word. We're going to use the word cohort when we talk about this group of learners. So if you do have to introduce jargon like this, I just think it's always good to provide a definition, at least on the first reference, to help your users understand what it is. Okay, tip 4, this one, again, probably pretty obvious, but write like how you speak. Sometimes you just are writing something and it's a lot longer than you want it to be and you don't know how to parse it. Like I've been in that boat many times where I'm just sort of stuck. And then I just think about how would I explain this to someone if I was just talking to my husband about this or talking to my parents about this? Like I would speak about it a lot more plainly. And I just think through that and then sometimes just write it down. And it's not going to be a great first draft, but it's a good starting point. And honestly, a lot of concepts can be boiled down to a pretty simple sentence or two. And write like you speak, but also speak it aloud. Just literally hearing yourself say the thing can often be a great tool for revision. As soon as you say it out loud, you realize like that's really bulky and awkward and I need to revise that. And one other thing I'll just point out here that I didn't call out as a tip, but just in general, is to use contractions, right? Like, yeah, we have this will be mailed to you at their address shown, and then it changes to will mail you. That's how people speak. Everyone speaks in contractions. And in general, they're going to make your writing just sound more friendly and human. So tip 5, this is like sort of a general UX design tip in general. I think people know this, but to give indicators of progress to users and make sure to also label that progress bar. I've been trying to do that in this presentation. That's why I've mapped it out the way I have in 4 steps. But just give your users insight into where they are in a process. And this is especially important in a longer flow. I had worked on an onboarding flow for new business users of the bank app that I worked on. And there was definitely a push to sort of like minimize the number of screens we put in front of users, which, you know, makes sense. It's onboarding. We're trying to get them through the process. But at the same time, there were a certain number of screens that were involved in that. It's not a very short process to onboard a new business user in this case. So I really pushed hard to add screens in between steps to give those progress indicators. And I think even though it's sort of, it seems kind of contrary because it's adding a little bit more, like it's adding screens, but I think it makes the process feel a little more manageable because you see along the way that you're making progress, which helps, because otherwise you could get pretty far in and think like, oh my gosh, when is this going to end? So I talked a little bit earlier about errors, but you want to get as specific as you possibly can with errors. As much as possible, you want to tell your users what happens, why they encountered an error, why it happens, and how to fix it or what to do next. I had recently worked on some error messages that were really difficult to write. They were related to moving money and what happens when a user exceeded their transfer limits, but for compliance reasons, we weren't really meant to share like what the transfer limits were. So that makes it a really difficult error message to write, not an ideal user experience, to basically say to users, you can't move this amount of money, but we also can't tell you how much you can move. So that was really tricky. But as a UX writer trying to be an advocate for users, we kind of like reached a middle ground and a bit of a band-aid solution, which was like, we're going to at least inform them that they can't move this amount of money. And then we're going to link to this help article about transfer limit so that they could kind of at least try to parse out what their transfer limit might be. So that I would say that's not ideal. But I think everybody understands that sometimes there are business requirements and needs that impact what you can actually do. So I think as much as possible, trying to have that influence and trying to make it user-centered is helpful. But here are a few error messages that I thought did things well because they're informative, right? Like ASOS, it's unavailable right now. Hey, but why not just go shop what else is in? Or Ticketmaster. Unfortunately, I did not get tickets to Hairspray touring because, and it wasn't just because my time's up. I think I just gave up. I decided I wasn't going to go see Hairspray. But yeah, these are all good because, you know, they give the context and they give you a way to move forward. They tell you how to proceed. So tip 7 would just be to avoid slang, metaphors, idioms, cultural references for the most part. If it works for your brand, then maybe it's okay. But in general, these can be alienating to your users for a few reasons. Idioms in particular, like roll off the tongue or draw a blank or break a leg, those can be really hard for non-native English speakers. They can also be difficult when you go into translation or localization. And just in general, I think slang, maybe it works like on social media, depending on your brand, but I think it can also sort of give off that like cringy fellow kids vibe that a brand's trying too hard to relate to users. Tip 8, this is kind of a fun one. Just adding small moments of delight, right? It's funny because I talk a lot about tone and maybe not using cutesy copy at the moment someone encounters an error. But I think a classic exception to that is the 404 message. A lot of brands use this as an opportunity to have fun, to put a little bit of personality into it. Because there's not much you can do. But I just thought this was a really fun one from Merriam-Webster. They like really leaned into their brand by using an opportunity to link to a bunch of different words and definitions. And then this one on the right is from, I think, Virgin Cruises. And I don't know, it just made me laugh. It just fit with their brand. Our posh but cozy cabin is ideal for a close-knit crew, for girl bands, or 4 cartoon turtles. Like, I just thought that was silly and cute. And I was like, that kind of fits. Like, it wouldn't fit with every brand, but it definitely does for Virgin. Okay, so when you're writing, use active voice. That is most of the time. Almost all the time you should use active voice. So you should say, instead of a message will be sent, we'll send a message. An active voice, it's the person or a subject that performs the action on the verb. But there are some times where that might not be preferable. So that relates to tip 10. So there are certain cases where you'd want to use passive voice. So your password was changed versus you changed your password. So if you want to put the emphasis on the object instead of the thing, you want to use passive voice. And in this case, it makes more sense because the emphasis here is on your password. It's not on you. It doesn't really matter that you changed the password. What you're trying to convey is that the password was changed. So in this case, it makes sense to use passive voice. And you also want to use passive voice when using active voice would sound like you're blaming your users. So like here, that username wasn't found, that's passive voice, but it's better than saying, hey, you idiot, you entered your username wrong, right? Like, so there are instances when passive voice is preferable. Generally, it's to avoid blaming your users or to put the emphasis on the object. Next one, I think, again, is probably pretty obvious, and in some cases this might work with a brand, but generally don't shame your users. I didn't include an example of it here, but I think we all know, like, confirm shaming, the stuff like, no, thank you, I don't like saving 15%. That's just not really cool. But then I also just include some examples here, some text that just can kind of sound judgy. These two, this is my cousin. I hope she doesn't mind that I used her screenshot here. But basically she gets this message from her dryer, her washer dryer, that says your wash is finished. Keeping wet laundry in the washer for too long can create an odor. Make sure to remove it for drying. Sorry, I came from a washer, not a dryer. And yeah, like she says, I feel like my washer is judging me. And then another friend had posted this one. Last week you were less active than the week before. Let's see if we can unpack this together. And and his comment was, yeah, my health app is the bullying therapist I didn't ask for. And then I think a lot of people probably are familiar with, like, Duolingo. They're kind of known for a bit of shaming. If you leave, you might just never be able to reach your full potential in life. So in Duolingo's case, maybe that works. I know some people are maybe a bit offended by it, but some people like that, right? It fits in with their brand voice at least. But like in these first two instances, you just have to be careful when you write these things. And I think they're well-intentioned. They're trying to encourage certain user behaviors. But then again, like, what if the reason the person didn't move much last week is because they were in the hospital, right? Or and you're judging them for not moving last week. You really have to always think about your user's context for messages like these and determine if they're really worth it. And it all kind of goes back to having empathy for your user and being aware of the tone that you're using. Okay, finally, we are on to our last step, I swear, or our last tip here. Format for readability. I put a bunch of stuff into this one. So as you probably know, people read in an F pattern. They skim when they're reading online. So anything you can do to kind of break up the text and make it easier to skim, the better. And you can use these different formatting tricks to your advantage. You can and should use headers. If this is when you're kind of writing longer text as well. Use headers to break it up. In general, people are going to find left aligned text easiest to read. So you don't want to center or right aligned text if you can avoid it. And people really like reading bulleted lists. Maybe not in this exact format because this is not grammatically correct, but I just was showing it for the sake of example. But all of these things are going to help make your text more readable, along with lots of line breaks. So here are all these things. We don't need to go through them again. I know we just talked about all of them, but I will share out the slides after anyway, so we can always refer back to these if it would be helpful. And then finally, we're on to the end. I swear this will not take too long. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the tools of the trade, including, yes, I will talk a little bit about AI, even though it is not my area of expertise, yes, I want to talk a little bit about the robot in the room. Kathleen, what about generative AI? Is UX writing even going to keep being a thing? Good question. The layoffs have come for a lot of the UX design field, and there have been plenty of content designers and UX writers who've been affected by it, myself included. So, we hear often, I think, that AI might be coming for our jobs, especially people in writing positions. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But this did make me laugh. I do have some feelings about this, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit here. In particular, I'm mostly focusing on ChatGPT and large language models. For me personally, I know some people have probably had different experiences with them. I find them good for brainstorming and for rough first drafts. I have not found them to be at a place right now where I feel that they could replace me. But also, I think a lot of that goes back to the fact that writing is not 100% of my job. I need a lot of context to do my job. I do a lot of stakeholder management. A lot of my job is understanding business and user requirements and learning our product deeply. So it's really hard to impart that on something like a ChatGPT. But I will talk about a couple tips that might be helpful. And I have to thank Helena, who I think is on this call, because she sent me some tips from a prompting course that she took. So one thing that you might find helpful, if let's say you're a UX designer or somebody who's been tasked with writing interface content, but you don't feel super comfortable doing it yourself, is you can go into something like ChatGPT and do this persona prompting. So start out your request by saying, act as a UX writer and do this, or respond to me as if I'm a UX content designer. And that will at least put it in the mindset of like this, it'll keep a lot of the things in mind that we just talked through, some of those tips for writing interface content. That being said, I said, act as UX writer and write a 404 message for a website that sells home appliances. And honestly, I cringed. I thought some of this was kind of weird, and I know there's a lot to read here, but ending with happy homemaking, I don't know. I don't think that this is great UX writing. So it spit that out, and then I followed up and said, just can you rewrite that to be more concise and serious? And it did make that much more serious and probably more usable. So I think in general, like this might need a little bit of finessing, but this is going to be better. And then I tried persona prompting, so doing that same thing, acting as a UX writer, and right up front asking it to be a little more concise, but also saying it's okay to use a little humor, because I felt like that previous example sort of stripped out any humor that might have been there. And this one's okay, but head back to the homepage to find your way back to appliance paradise. I don't know. I have some thoughts about that. I don't know that I would be calling my appliance website appliance paradise, but they tried. So then I tried this zero shot prompting, which is when you give it a task, but you don't give it any example. So that's actually, that's before too what I had done, but I didn't include the persona prompting here. So I just said, write a 404 error message for a home appliance website. And then you can see this is really long. Like there's no reason that these needs to be as long as it is. But it just goes on. And so I asked it to follow up. I said, can you make that less wordy? And is this good or not? I'll let you be the judge of that. But I did take it, and I thought there's some stuff here that I could work with. And one of the versions earlier had talked about like a missing sock. So I thought, actually, that's not a terrible idea. For a home appliance website, we probably sell washer dryers. That's kind of fun, right? So maybe just like a sock in the laundry, that page seems to have gone missing. That's a kind of cutesy way to tie in your brand while actually still giving the user information and keeping it short and concise. Then there's this few shot prompting, which is giving a few different examples to help guide how it responds. So I tried that. I took a bunch of 404 error messages that I think were Disney Pixar error messages. I basically said, can you give me another one, taking these into consideration? And what we came out with is, oopsie daisy, looks like Mickey's magic couldn't find the page you're seeking. Did someone misplace Cinderella's glass slipper again? Double check the URL or glide back to our enchanting homepage for more Disney delights. So again, probably not something I would use on a live website. But you know what? Like it gave some ideas. So something like this might work, like taking some ideas from that and saying, oh gosh, not even Mickey's Magic could help us find the page you're looking for. So for me, it's a brainstorming tool. It's a first draft tool. It's a place to get ideas. Other people might find it helpful. And that was just isolated to 404 messages. So there's other things that can be helpful for. But for me, it's really more of a starting point than an endpoint. And I'm just going to talk about just a couple more quick things, and I'm almost done here, I swear. I talked about the 4 dimensions of voice. This is accessible. It's through Nielsen Norman Group. You can find that. I think it's really helpful for if you don't have this kind of documentation to go through that for your product. And then Hemingway Editor. This is one I did not touch on, but I use quite a bit. I use this a lot when I worked in learning design too. It's a free tool for checking the grade level of your content to see how readable it is. When you're writing content, you really want to make it ideally not more than an 8th grade reading level, which can be really difficult when you start plugging in content and seeing what it comes out with in Hemingway Editor. But really for like wide audiences, keeping it 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, that's ideal. So that's just a free tool. You can take any block of text, hit enter, and it will spit out basically a grade level, and it will tell you if you're writing it at an appropriate level. And then finally, if you want to just practice some of this stuff on your own, there's the daily UX writing challenge. This is free. It gives you daily prompts. You see this like all over all the UX writing, content design communities, people trying it out, trying to break into the field, get something for their portfolio. But yeah, it's a really good practice and tool just to practice different requirements, how to react to totally different prompts and scenarios. So that is it for me. That is the end. I couldn't find a place to incorporate this, but I thought it was so funny I couldn't not include it. Don't write large head hats women, hats for big head woman. I will admit I have a pretty big head, but I still didn't appreciate being called big head woman when I was searching for large hats. So yeah, just don't do that and you're probably gonna be okay. All right, so yeah, that was it for me. Like I said, this was a pretty high level overview of UX writing, the sort of things we think about. I didn't really get deep into accessibility or stakeholder management or localization, any of that stuff, but I have many resources I can share if people are interested in learning more about those things. And I went a little over. Sorry about that.
No, it's all the time you need. Thank you so much for the presentation tonight. This was great. Sorry, all if my mic is picking up a little snoring. She just kicked in a few minutes ago. But no, I have a couple questions to get things started. I went ahead and pasted some of those tools of the trade in the chat there. If anybody has any questions they want to ask as well, please feel free to add them in. But kind of going back to the beginning of the presentation, thinking about the concept of good UX writing is invisible when it's done correctly. How can we advocate as UX professionals for this skill, whether it's training for it or trying to promote the UX side of writing in our organizations, if it can be hard to even see the impact there? Any recommendations or any strategies you've used?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's difficult. I mean, that's like kind of an ongoing debate too, is like, how do you show your impact as a UX writer? Because, a lot of times the text is not really divorced from the design. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. The content is just as much a part of as the visual design. In fact, like a lot of times it's good to be content led because the content is what users are engaging with things for. But, I think really just usability testing can often flag a lot of concerns that people have or issues that people are running into. They might question what a term means or show confusion. And if you can get them talking loud and explaining that it has to do with like them not understanding the words on the page or maybe the way the content is laid out, I think that can be very validating for the value of content design. And Sarah, who I think might still be on this call, I'd worked with her and we did some kind of cool content testing when we were building learning platform and the terminology that we use in there. And that was great because it was a lot of work up front to do all of that testing to understand like what words would our users understand. And to socialize that at the organization was also tough to make sure that, people have a lot of opinions on the words that you use, right? So that was tricky, but it was really helpful because we were able to point back to that user research that was done to say, like, people don't understand this term. Like, I know this is the word we use internally, but our users don't understand what that means. So I think having the research to back it up is really helpful. But yeah, as far as getting kind of like executive stakeholders to understand the value of content design, just show them a bad experience, I guess, and maybe then show them how that could be improved with content.
Sure. No, that's a great call out. Always easier to make an argument with data. And you mentioned too, everybody has an opinion, everybody has a perspective. How about building collaborative relationships? Especially with your marketing teams, your legal teams, again, groups that have a very long-standing investment in the copy on the website. Any recommendations for building partnerships there and trying to really show what you can do to help elevate their work beyond, trying to avoid maybe a competitive environment or anything like that, but showing that we can really build this collaborative relationship.
Yeah, definitely. And that can be a challenge, right? Like kind of building those relationships is always tricky. And sometimes you have, especially like kind of legal or compliance teams who, they have very particular language that they want to use. So I think, again, it's just a kind of a matter of making your case, showing maybe a before and after. That's something I do a lot when I work with designers. And I'm working on, they want me to work on some sort of text string. I'll often show them like 3 or 4 examples because I don't, often there's not one correct answer, right? Writing is very subjective. There's a lot of different ways you can approach it. So I'll often present them with a few options and say, like, do you want to go a little more irreverent here? Do you want to be more straight laced? Like, do we like this term? Do we like that term? So I think doing that similarly with legal and with marketing teams can be helpful as well, because it also shows that you value their opinion and you want to get their buy-in and their feedback. So that's been an approach I've taken before, is just being really open about my work, like trying not to work in a silo, putting it out there, open myself up to feedback, right? Like throwing it in Slack and saying, here's 4 versions of something, here's the context, which one, literally asking people to kind of vote on it with an emoji to say which one they like best. And I think that also gives people an opportunity to say, like, no, this conflicts with our brand voice, or no, we can't say that for compliance purposes. But I think generally just sort of welcoming and inviting people into that writing process is a way to help build those stakeholder relationships that I found that's worked in the past.
Awesome. Yeah, great recommendation. We have one in the audience from Nathan. For those of us who are UX teams of one, any suggestions to develop our own UX writing skills? Good starting places to learn more of these strategies. You mentioned the daily UX writing challenge. That seems like a great resource to at least have some things kind of thrown at you and kind of put you in a place where you really have to be mindful of what you're writing. Any
Mhm.
more places you'd recommend for kind of getting started on the skill building?
Definitely. Yeah, I've got like a whole bookshelf of great books back here, but I would definitely, I'll throw the title of this one in the chat too. Um, the other CDs on this call probably know what I'm going to say, but it's Strategic Writing for UX by Tori Podmajersky, I think is how you say it. And she's really well known in the UX writing community. She, I think, used to work for Google and now is an independent consultant, but that's just like almost like the Bible of UX writing. It has basically everything you need to know. And really good examples. What I like about it is she threads these 3 fictional companies all throughout the book. So with different voices, very different voices. One is like kind of I don't want to say uptight, but like a country club, like sort of old money, like ritzy, like very proper and formal sounding. And then one is like a mobile game app with a young audience. So very different voice. And then I can't remember what the third is, but it falls somewhere in between those. So I really like it because she talks about these great UX writing principles, but you see this real world application as to how they work for different organizations. And it's just super informative, really easy to read, which I'd hope it would be considering it's all about UX writing. But that is a good place to start. And there's also the Slack or community called Content and UX, which there's a lot of conversations in there. It could probably be a little overwhelming for somebody who's like a team of one and is probably very, very busy. But there are a lot of people in there who aren't necessarily content designers, UX writers by trade, but they'll go in there just to ask for advice, or like we get people posting in there a lot that say, like, I'm a UX designer, I'm trying to work on this. So people are more than willing to give feedback and thoughts there. So I think that's another really good space to check out. But yeah, I also think just the UX writing daily challenge, there's a lot of resources out there. People post all the time about their challenges, and there's LinkedIn groups where people talk about it. So I think that's a really quick way and kind of like quick and dirty way to get really a lot better at thinking like a UX writer.
Awesome. Great suggestions. Thank you so much. And we're coming just about up on time. So I'll close out with one final question kind of on this as well. Thinking about how we integrate these skills into our process. If we're at the early stages of design, our visual fidelity may be very low, but we're already writing some copy. We're already starting to label things and provide maybe placeholders. But when would you recommend in our design process we're thinking about things like creating a tone chart?
As early as possible. Definitely. I
Okay.
mean, really, yeah, like, which is not always possible, right? But like, I think it's pretty important. Like a tone chart, the one that I shared earlier in this presentation, that's pretty standard. Like most companies could probably pick that up and use that. Like most places are going to have pretty serious legal content and kind of more fun onboarding content. So something like a tone chart, like there are resources out there that you can borrow. But as far as deciding what your brand voice should be, I think the earlier you can do that, the better, because otherwise you risk having a lot of legacy content that doesn't relate to the brand once you've gone ahead and done that work to define it, which anyone knows, like trying to update legacy content to fit a new brand voice is always going to be difficult and probably isn't going to happen. So the work, if you can do that work up front, then you're going to be a lot better off. But it's not impossible. Like rebrands happen, and it's always better to have that happen at some point. Better late than never, right? Like to start making your content be more user centered.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially with our modern design tools. We can componentize a lot of the visual things, easier to kind of update those and get a clear picture, but the writing has to be rewritten once it's done.
Mm-hmm.
There's no magic button to change the tone or change the personality.
Yep.
Well, unless you ask ChatGPT, maybe, but
I
you
don't
might
know. I
wind
saw
up
some of
doing
those
longer
Mickey Mouse
editing.
examples.
Yes, they're a little much for me. All right, but wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody's attendance tonight. Again, Kathleen, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Glenn, thank you so much for bringing some light to something that is a little more of an underlooked or invisible topic, but it's so critical. It really underpins everything we're doing to present this information to the user. So thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.